what you are basically. Deep, deep down, far, far in, is simply the fabric and structure of existence itself.
Peace for all men and women, for all men and women, for all men and women. Not merely peace in our time, peace in all time.
Honestly expressing yourself.
Peace for all men and women, for all men and women, for all men and women. Not merely peace in our time, peace in all time.
The fabric and structure of existence itself.
Honestly expressing yourself.
Hi, everybody. Welcome to the Parallel Mike podcast. I'm your host, Mike, and a big thank you for joining me for the latest episode. On tonight's show, we have a new guest. His name is Dr. Rob Williams. As you're going to find out in tonight's show, Rob knows a lot about a lot. He's a professor. He's also somebody who is big into natural health. He spent many years as a yak farmer, which is extremely interesting. And he lives up there in the far north of the USA in Vermont, and he is a very proud Vermontian, as I learned. That's a new word for me. But Rob also is an expert when it comes to weather modification. And this is something that is on all of our minds right now, because if you look up towards the sky, you'll probably notice it doesn't look like it did when we was youngsters. In fact, it's very hard to even see the sun nowadays, and everybody knows something is going on. But what many people don't know is just how long it's been going on, and also just how many things are happening at once. It's not just one objective they're trying to achieve up there. There's many that are happening simultaneously. So in part number one, that's what me and Rob get into. Then in part number two, we kind of shift gears a bit and start to talk about what we can do to purify our bodies and detoxify ourselves from some of the harmful consequences of all of that spraying. So it's a really good two-parter. Of course, if you're just around for part number one, you'll get a lot out of it. But members, I think you'll enjoy that change of pace going into part number two when we discuss solutions as well. So with that, let's get to the episode. Members, please head over to the website to sign in and listen to the full show. For everyone else, you can just continue listening for free. But if you do enjoy it, please consider coming to join us over on the website to access part number two and to support me and the content. In closing, I hope you're all well, healthy, and reasonably happy. Take care of yourselves, and I'll see you in the next one. Hi, everybody. Welcome to the Parallel Mike podcast. Today, we are joined by a new guest on the show who I'm sure you're all going to really enjoy. His name is Dr. Rob Williams. He's a lecturer at Vermont University, a yak farmer, an author, a business owner, holistic health practitioner, activist. Rob, the list was pretty long, so I'm sure I've missed some out. And yeah, maybe you could start, Rob, by just taking us back a little bit, telling us about who you are, what you do. And then we'll get into some of these passions of yours, including geoengineering, which is one of the big things that is on a lot of people's minds right now.
Yeah, Mike, it's really wonderful to be with you on the Parallel Mike podcast. I love the name of your show. And briefly, I have lived as a New Englander from the Hudson River Valley in New York up to Vermont most of my life. Spent 10 years living out in New Mexico, where I currently am for this particular winter. And as you mentioned, I have been trained as an environmental historian here in Albuquerque at the University of New Mexico. And the beautiful thing, Mike, about environmental history is it gives you license to pretty much explore any topic under the sun you wish. So whether it's raising grass-fed animals like yaks, or it's looking up at the sky and wondering what's going on up there, when you see activity that doesn't appear natural or normal in your 57 years of existence, or doing a deep dive into human health and wellness and optimization, all of that for me has been part and parcel of my deep interest in stories and history and the human capacity to listen to stories. I think storytelling is one of our many superpowers, Mike, as a species, as Homo sapiens. So I guess in a nutshell, I'm very interested in stories and how we humans manifest those stories in our world.
As am I, actually, Rob. Yeah, that's something that throughout my life has been just a real fascination from being a young boy. Maybe we could start by just discussing Vermont a little bit, because that's a place I've always been really interested in, believe it or not. So when I found out that you lived there, you're the first person I know that does live in Vermont, and I know you are a proud. Is the expression a Vermonter? A Vermonter? Is that correct?
A Vermonter. Well, first of all, let me extend an invitation to you and your family, Mike. You're welcome to visit Vermont now, especially because our kids are out of their bedrooms. So we,
I'd love to go take a hike with you in those beautiful mountains you've got over there.
yeah, they are spectacular, and my wife and I are missing them a little bit out here in New Mexico. We're having the best winter in Vermont we've had in years, and so it's been fun to witness that from afar and to be in touch with all of our friends back there. But Vermont is a really unique place. You're right. Vermont, geopolitically, Vermont has the distinction, Mike, of being the only state out of all 50 of the United States that self-conceived as an independent republic back in the day. Vermont was its own country for 14 years. And yeah, what I mean by that is Vermont in 1777, the year after the Declaration of Independence was issued, kind of the famous founding document here in the United States, Vermonters issued their own constitution in a little town in Vermont called Windsor. And for 14 years, Vermonters governed themselves as an independent country, sometimes called the Republic of Vermont. And many people are familiar with the story of Ethan Allen and the Green Mountain Boys. Ethan Allen is sort of our George Washington equivalent in Vermont, the founding progenitor, if you will, of the Republic of Vermont. So Vermont had its own constitution, its own militia, its own coinage, its own post office, and its own town meeting tradition, which continues to this day. So Vermonters, and interestingly, Mike, many Vermonters have forgotten this legacy, I think at our peril. But Vermont was its own country and then joined the United States by vote at a town meeting in March of 1791. So imagine that sort of 1777 to 1791 period, Vermont governing itself exclusively and outside the realm of the British Empire, the local indigenous peoples, the new United States Continental Congress. It's quite something. And sometimes people say, but Rob, what about Texas, the Lone Star Republic? What about California, the Bear Flag Republic? Those two states were, very briefly, made republics after war with Mexico and the United States. But Vermont self-constituted, and that's an important difference, I think. So there is this tradition, Mike, of independence coupled with what I would call communitarianism in Vermont. We look out for one another. Neighbors take care of neighbors. One of my dear old friends, he's no longer with us, but he taught politics at the University of Vermont for decades, and he is an expert, was in Vermont's New England's town meeting tradition, where we gather regularly and make decisions for the town. And he said, Rob, it's kind of like this. You may not like your neighbor in Vermont, but if your neighbor is stuck in a ditch, you're going to stop and pull your neighbor out of the ditch because he or she would do the same for you in a pinch. That's communitarianism sort of in a nutshell.
Yeah, that's awesome. That's a really interesting history, actually. You know, I first heard of Vermont through running, because you've actually got one of the oldest ultra marathons, the oldest 100-milers in America, the Vermont 100. Do you know that race, Rob?
Yes. In fact, my wife and I have both run pieces of it over the years. Yeah, it runs right by our roots.
So many people talk about that race lovingly, about those. Is it the Green Mountains that they're called out there?
Yeah. And that race, Mike, runs, if you imagine the Green Mountains running sort of up the center spine of Vermont from south to north. And Vermont, most people probably know, but it's a very sort of vertically shaped state, kind of snugged up against New Hampshire. We've got the Connecticut River on the east side of Vermont, the Hudson River and Lake Champlain on the west. And that race runs up Route 100. It's a 2-lane state road that runs up the east side of the spine of the Green Mountains. It's stunning.
It looks, I've only seen photographs of it, but for me, those are the ideal hills to be into running, where you've got lush green forests, you've got ravines coming down. And that's why this topic that we're going to discuss tonight is really important as well, because we've both witnessed across our lifetime the pollution in our skies and what's going on up there. And it's every single day. Some people assume it's a modern day phenomena. It's not. And I'd love for us to maybe start there. You could tell us a little bit about that history with geoengineering.
Yeah, I'm really glad we're talking about this, Mike. It's a really important topic. So let me throw out our website for folks who are interested. It's www.our, O-U-R, geoengineering age, our geoengineeringage.org. And that particular website houses now 8 years of scientific and environmental historical research. We've published, I think now 4 dozen peer-reviewed scientific papers on the environmental causes and consequences of geoengineering, what some call weather and climate modification, what some refer to as chemtrails. Not a term we use, but a term that's popular out there. And we're in the midst of finishing 2 historical series, one on geoengineering, where did it come from? And the other on electromagnetic frequency energy, the role of electricity in human life. Because those two, geoengineering and electricity, electromagnetic energy, are very closely connected. And I, like you, Mike, I have been a farmer for many years. I hesitate to describe myself this way these days, but an environmentalist on even-numbered days, let's say. And I love being outside, and I spent a lot of time in nature, looking at the sky, moving through the woods, swimming in the rivers and lakes in Vermont. And yes, it's been very troubling. I'm 57 years old. It's been very troubling to notice, particularly over the past 10 years, I would say, this unnatural, artificial activity in our skies that, as you just mentioned, is a form of toxic air pollution. And I think that's one way to conceive of geoengineering. And you're right, Mike, when you say that the impulse to control the weather, let's say, goes back a really long time. In ancient China, I spent 10 years roaming across China, recruiting Chinese high school students. And so I saw firsthand from 2009 till about 2019, the Chinese government is very open globally and publicly about their geoengineering activities. Most famously, the Beijing Olympics of 2008. They said, yeah, we're modifying the weather before you all show up to make sure that everything's looking good in Beijing for the international competition, right? And, you know, when you're a totalitarian government, you can, I guess, make such claims. But what's curious about geoengineering is once you see it, Mike, in the sky and begin to realize what's going on, you cannot unsee it. And in ancient China, there was a phrase the emperors used to use with their various fortune tellers, let's say. They spoke of controlling the weather and atmospheric rivers. If you imagine rivers that run across the earth, there are rivers that run through the atmosphere and move moisture around, right? And it's a phrase that we're just beginning to kind of grapple with here in the 21st century. And the ancient Chinese spoke of what they called in English from the Mandarin, smart human shadow work. Smart human shadow work, which was this interest they had in trying to figure out if they could somehow control or steer the weather using various technologies and, from chanting and prayer to more sophisticated, let's say, or more material, let's say, technologies. So this impulse to control the weather goes back thousands of years. And if we fast forward to modern times, in the 1800s, there were a number of different techniques that were used to try and control the weather. And I like to always throw out a couple of good books, because reading books is helpful. It's where all of the good information is collected. And there's a book about this that folks might be interested in finding. It's called "The Rainmakers: Pluviculture to World War II." It's by a guy named Clark Spence. And his book, The Rainmakers, looks at early attempts from the 1800s up into World War II to try and change, enact, create weather using concussion, essentially detonations, firing things up into the sky. There were all these various techniques that were used. So this interest we humans have in, it's a hubristic thing, Mike. There's a certain arrogance, right? It takes to think that we could somehow control these natural systems. And then things really took off, just to bring it full circle, things really took off with the invention of aircraft. World War II, beginning in the 1940s, we see planes traveling through the lower atmosphere with silver iodide, releasing silver iodide to increase the surface area of the lower atmosphere to attract moisture, create clouds, and make it rain. And this is probably the first sort of truly modern example of geoengineering broadly defined, what we might call weather manipulation. Silver iodide in clouds to help farmers, or perhaps for other reasons as well. And this activity has been ongoing for almost 100 years, weather manipulation. And let me pause there.
It's certainly not something that's hidden. If you look back throughout the history, there's many papers, many admissions, which I'm sure you'll have quite an encyclopedic knowledge of. And I guess that's where we've struggled as people that have tried to point this out, in that most people don't go and look at that stuff, and they hear us speak about it and they think that we're the crazy ones, that we're inventing this stuff, and you'll get termed a conspiracy theorist, which is kind of wild when you understand that there is so much information out there, which is why I really liked your website. You lay it out in a way that is academic, which is what a lot of people need. I've got a lot of friends who are professors. They're very concerned about climate change. They're very concerned about the planet. And we definitely have crossover. I'm concerned about some of those things too, not necessarily the climate change in terms of how they're thinking of it, but in terms of pollution. And I'm sure if they truly understood the scope, Rob, of what's happening up there, they would be horrified by it and they would be activists for it. But it's getting them to that point so that they're able to see what we see and doing it in a way that's not going to get us thrown into the conspiracy basket. So maybe we could start by actually discussing your journey in this. How did you first become aware of this?
Yeah. And let me, to your point of a moment ago, Mike, it's unfortunate that the last to the table in terms of discussing geoengineering seems to be the environmentalist community. It's very troubling to me. And you just gave us the reason why this is so. There has been so much obsessive focus on the problem of carbon emissions and greenhouse gas emissions for 2 generations now. Like that narrative, and we'll talk about perhaps where that came from and why. That narrative, which began in the 1980s in earnest, has really captured the mind collectively of the environmentalist community. So much so that they are unwilling to acknowledge the history of weather and climate modification. It's just not something they're interested in even talking about, let alone researching. It's very strange. And we'll circle back to that. But I want to mention a second book because you mentioned academics. If you have a skeptical academic, Mike, let me recommend a book called Fixing the Sky. It's by a Colby College professor emeritus, gentleman named James Colby. He's retired, newly retired, but his book is called Fixing the Sky, The Checkered History of Weather and Climate Modification. And that is probably the single most comprehensive scholarly book we have on the history of geoengineering up until the 1980s, where the book ends, unfortunately. But It is a beautiful scholarly overview. And again, for folks who are like, I think this is all theoretical. We're not really interested at OGA, our geoengineering age. We're not interested in talking about whether this is happening or not. It's been happening for 100 years, and we need to get our arms around it, which is why we call our project and our website our geoengineering age. We need to take some ownership for the past 100 years and stop pretending that it hasn't been happening. So I first became involved in this work when a dear friend and mentor here in Vermont, a gentleman named Ian Baldwin, who I have worked with in various capacities for, 20 years. He is a lifelong environmentalist, bird watcher, the founder of Vermont's most courageous independent publishing house. You may have heard of Chelsea Green. They supported the Dark Mountain Manifesto over there in the UK, which you may have heard of, those guys. Paul Kingsnorth and Dugald Hines and company. And Ian came to me one day in 2017. He said, Rob, there's something going on up there, and I need your help in bringing it to public attention. And at first I said, Ian, I've got enough to do. I'm raising 2 kids. I'm teaching at the university. I'm running a yak farm. I'm busy, but send me what you got. So he sent me a 50-page essay that he had written about geoengineering. And I sat on it for several months, Mike, as one does when one is hesitant perhaps to open the door to a new, reality. And then I finally walked through the door with Ian, and together, he and I built our geoengineering age with 2 other very important members of our team. The first, Dr. J. Marvin Herndon, was a San Diego-based nuclear geochemist who ran an independent lab in San Diego from the 1940s until just last year when he retired. And Marvin, Dr. Herndon, has been tracking the changing of these former cerulean blue skies over San Diego for decades. And he has written and published most of the science papers at OGA with another gentleman, our other team member, a very prominent public health official in South Florida, Dr. Mark Whiteside. Again, environmentalist, bird watcher, looks at the sky every day. Marvin, Mark, and Ian started working together and then brought me in to help magnify the publishing of their efforts. And that is how OGA came into being. And then the last thing I'll say, Ian and I then began work on these 2 environmental historical series that I mentioned, one on the history of geoengineering and the other on electromagnetic energy. And these 2 series complement the science, I would say. So, for example, folks interested in the California so-called wildfires might go to our website and find our 2018 peer-reviewed science paper on how geoengineering has turned California into a tinderbox. The forests, the streams, the lakes, the soil, over the past couple of decades of the consistent spraying, to use your word. And finally, we brought on, and this has been a very important addition, a young gentleman, Paul Bean, shout out to Paul, who has really taken on our social media and promotional efforts. And I think that partly accounts for why we're having more conversations, Mike, like the one you and I are having here. We realized after 6 or 7 years of doing the research, we needed to figure out ways to get all of this out into the open. And maybe we'll talk about this, but there's a very small geoengineering research community in the United States. And it's a bit fraught for reasons we may wish to get into, but I don't want to distract us. Anyway, that's how I got involved and have been involved for 7 years now. And I will end this little soliloquy with pointing out very exciting news. Just this past week in the Vermont State Legislature, we saw introduced a piece of legislation that calls out geoengineering and demands for state and local control of the atmosphere over our skies in Vermont. I never would have thought 3-4 years ago, Mike, that this ever would have happened at the legislative level. But we have folks who have been lobbying the legislature, using our research, building networks as one has to do in the political world. And it was really gratifying to see a tripartisan, we have three parties in Vermont, Democrats, Republicans, and progressives, to see all three parties have representatives signing on to this piece of legislation. So it's a start. We're the 27th state in the United States to introduce geoengineering free legislation. And we're under no illusions, for reasons we can talk about. There's some very powerful globalist, let's say, players who are interested in continuing this activity in the skies overhead. However, this is a big step. I think it will raise consciousness. It will help organize people and educate. And to your point of a few minutes ago, hopefully bring in the most important constituency we need at the table, which is the environmentalist community. We need them to take this seriously. We really do.
Yeah, I agree. Yeah, for sure. I think that would be a tipping point moment if you could get them to actually care about something like this. I know in the country that I'm in 2014, there was a wave of protests about geoengineering, or chemtrails back then, people probably called it. It went on for about a year or so and then just disappeared. My wife said it just went, and they went back to climate change and carbon emissions and things like this. But there was kind of a moment, and like you said, I think it's because the powers and the funding behind the agendas at that level are so strong for all of these different supposedly independent movements, which we know they're not, because when you trace the funding back, it goes to the same sources. And they get to write the script for these activist groups, and that's the way it works. And maybe for listeners, think it's much more complex than we might imagine. It's not just that they're trying to block out the sun, or they're trying to just see the clouds. What does it actually entail, Rob? Today, in 2025, what kind of activities does it encompass when we speak about geoengineering?
Yeah, really good question. And I think the activities that fall under the umbrella term geoengineering can be found in the sky. They can be found on the ground. They can actually be found under the ground. Carbon sequestration, the idea that we're going to somehow take carbon out of the atmosphere and inject it into the soil. So the term geoengineering really does umbrella a whole number of different initiatives and technologies that have been underway for, again, quite some time, decades. If we were to pick up the thread historically that we left off with, the 1950s and 60s is kind of the heyday of weather manipulation with silver iodide, small planes over very small regions. But by the 1960s and 70s, there is open conversation in the Pentagon, in the corporate sphere. Lyndon Johnson, who is the liberal Democrat from Texas, replaced John F. Kennedy when JFK was assassinated, says quite publicly and famously in 1962 at a speech at a Texas university, "He who controls the weather, Mike, controls the world." And this public conversation about weather manipulation and climate modification is very public until 1978. Two things happened in the 70s. Number one, it became apparent that weather manipulation had some serious environmental consequences. Most famously, during the Vietnam War, the United States Air Force was seeding the skies over North Vietnam in a famous operation you may have heard of called Operation Popeye, to try and flood the jungle and flood out the North Vietnamese army, to destroy the trails. And a very famous journalist here in the United States, Seymour Hersh, won at least one Pulitzer Prize for his work, wrote a series of articles calling attention to Operation Popeye. And this provoked a global outcry about weather manipulation. Enter the United Nations with the so-called Environmental Modification Treaty of the late 1970s. The U.S., as a signatory, agrees to the terms of this treaty, which state that weather warfare, weather and climate manipulation, will not be used as a weapon of war. U.S. signs the treaty. All conversation about weather and climate modification at that point seems to go underground and is replaced by a new story, which we're all familiar with, that greenhouse gas emissions. So the United Nations funded Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change has been telling us, and now 6 reports over the course of the past few decades, greenhouse gas emissions are what is causing global warming, and this presents a potential catastrophe for us. Now, let me throw out a third book. And this is a very important book. It's not quite as well known as the other two, Fixing the Sky and The Rainmakers. A book by Bernie Lewin called Searching for the Catastrophe Signal. Searching for the Catastrophe Signal. And what Bernie Lewin does is he goes back and looks at the history of the United Nations seeking a catastrophe around which they can organize, right? For a while, as I'm sure your listeners and viewers know, it was not global warming, but global cooling in the 1970s that was the catastrophe. And then it was the hole in the ozone layer, you may recall, that was going to be the catastrophe. And now, of course, it's climate change, greenhouse gas emissions that is the catastrophe. And you may be wondering, why does the United Nations need a catastrophe to hang its hat on? Well, a catastrophe, of course, marshals support for moving the human species planetarily, globally, in particular directions the UN and others who fund them wish humans to be moved. So this book, Searching for the Catastrophe Signal, kind of lays out behind the scenes, if you will, this internal conversation that's happening amongst these globalists. So the Environmental Modification Treaty drives all conversation about weather and climate modification underground. The United Nations funds the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change to introduce a new story about climate change. It's carbon, greenhouse gas emissions that are the problem. And then, of course, they bring in their army of promoters, including my dear friend here in Vermont, Bill McKibben, widely acknowledged as the most important environmentalist of our time, certainly in the United States, to kind of flog incessantly the climate change, greenhouse gas narrative. And again, I think this has been going on since, you could see Earth Day, the creation of Earth Day in 1970 as the catalyst that kicks off this new story about catastrophic climate change. And of course, all the while paying no attention to the trails in the sky that are contributing to this respiratory pollution that's raining down on all living creatures on the regular.
And when we look at the different activities that they're doing, Rob, and we try to imagine the applications of what those things in the sky actually are, is it just related to, let's say, agriculture, or is it just related to one or two different disciplines? Or is there a whole host of them? And actually, when we're looking up, it could be one of many different things taking place, because it feels to me like the list is growing on that. I've had so many different suggestions.
Yeah, that's a really good question. So let me throw out another website, geoengineeringmonitor.org. The geoengineeringmonitor.org, really good site that actually has built an interactive global map, Mike, of various geoengineering projects in the sky, on the land, on the sea, around the world. And as the name suggests, is monitoring these projects in real time. So before we talk about maybe the goals and applications, I love this question, quickly to understand how geoengineering works scientifically, I have a very simple mnemonic I like to use. It helps me. This is really what we might think of a pump, jump, and dump scheme. Geoengineering, pump, jump, and dump. Rob, what do you mean by that? Pump, jump, and dump. So nanoparticulate metals are pumped into the atmosphere at various layers. And when we pump nanoparticulate metals into the sky, we can then jump those metals with an electromagnetic energy current or field or what have you, almost like turning the sky into a bit of a battery, you can imagine that. We can ionize the sky. We can play with the electromagnetic field with those nanoparticulate metals. And at that point, we geoengineers can begin to experiment with moving, creating, destroying, moving weather around using these electromagnetic energy fields. And some of your listeners and viewers may be familiar with the prototype, the pilot project for jumping the sky, program called HARP in Gakona, Alaska. HARP is an acronym. It stands for High Altitude Active Auroral Research Project. It's a series of phased array antennas, all sort of emerging out of the ground, which together can create and direct a particular electromagnetic energy field. And this project goes back to the late 60s, early 70s. So again, these technologies have been in play for a long time. And it sounds a little Star Wars to folks who are kind of like, really? We're pumping nano metal particulates into the sky, and then we're jumping those nanoparticulates with electromagnetic energy. It sounds like sci-fi. But again, tens of thousands of pages of public documents readily available to anybody who cares to look. And then, of course, the catastrophic consequence of this is the dumping part, because all of those nano metal particulates fall to the earth, and they coat the trees, and they infuse the soil, and they immerse themselves into streams and lakes and rivers. And when you coat the earth with nanoparticulate metals regularly over decades, of course, there are dramatic negative environmental consequences that ensue for all living creatures. You know, you may have heard of the phrase, we're living in a sixth great extinction. Elizabeth Colbert of the New York Times has put that phrase on the map. And the sixth great extinction is being blamed on an excess of carbon, which scientifically doesn't really make a whole lot of sense, given that carbon is the building block for all life. And it's carbon dioxide that provides the breathing gas for all plants across the world. It's the nanoparticulate metals that are killing the soils, the bees, the bats, the birds, the bugs. It's nanoparticulate metals that are contributing to respiratory ailments, which are skyrocketing, as we've seen across the world in places where this kind of activity is happening. So pump, jump, dump. And when you begin to sort of recognize this, as we call it at OGA, the single most important yet underreported global environmental issue of our time, geoengineering, it begins to help frame up and make sense of what's going on with this environmental situation we find ourselves in. So let me pause there before we get into applications, because I think it's important to look at the science of the pumping and the jumping and the consequent dumping, if you will.
Yeah, I really like how you're taking us through this one, Rob, so that we can understand it. And one of the things that you mentioned there that I'm sure listeners are aware of is HARP, but they will understand that this is something that is still, for many people, associated with conspiracy. But what you're saying is, no, it's official. That exists. And what is the stated aims of HARP? And what are the rebuttals when people claim that this is having a negative effect?
Yeah, it's such a good question. And so geoengineering, like every other technology, Mike, is a dual use technology. And what I mean by dual use is there are military applications that are often kept hidden. And then there are civilian and scientific applications that are always sort of made public, and we kind of lead with the science and the experimentation, right? So first and foremost, it's important for all of us to recognize that geoengineering is primarily a military technology. Now, it's never pitched that way, even in the public documents. You know, HARP, what we're doing at HARP in Gakona, Alaska, at the University of Alaska, is scientific experimentation, they will say, right? But when you can ionize the lower atmosphere, you can pump and jump and begin to control, let's say, the weather and climate. Number one, as the Pentagon is fond of saying, you are able to optimize a command and control environment for military application. Command and control is a Pentagon term, and it really refers to controlling the battle space, if you will, if that makes sense. So imagine if you are a military and or a government interested in geopolitical advantage, command and control through geoengineering applications renders you that much more powerful. Second of all, while we're at it, we're controlling the battle space. We can improve communications and surveillance technologies and initiatives by ionizing the atmosphere. You can throw, for example, a radar signal or a computer signal much further through an ionized atmosphere than you could a non-ionized atmosphere, if that makes sense. You can deploy technologies like the one that Julian Assange at WikiLeaks warned us about more than 10 years ago, so-called smart dust, little nanobots, right, released into the atmosphere that can track and surveil activity, right? You can deploy smart dust much more effectively through an ionized atmosphere. Does that make sense?
It does, and it's actually very scary, Rob. The military applications are even more terrifying than the supposed weather-related or environmental applications, I would say, because those are the ones that I would anticipate if you have a government or a overarching world structure, let's call it a globalist entity that wants to harm humankind. That would be a very efficient way of doing it, wouldn't it?
Yes, and that's a good segue to our next application. So we have command and control, number one. We have communications and surveillance, number two. Number three, computers specifically, networked computers can be optimized in an ionized networked atmosphere, if you will. That makes sense. So let's not forget about the computers. Fourth is this question of climate change, right? We're being told when we hear the phrase climate change that the earth is warming and this is creating potential catastrophe, killing all life on earth, right? What we argue at OGA is precisely the opposite, that geoengineering technology is being its stated goal is to dim the sun, brighten the clouds, shield the planet from harmful greenhouse gases, if you will. But we're arguing what's going on is the opposite. The militaries and governments are using geoengineering to gradually warm the planet, melt the polar ice caps to give us access to all of the natural resources we currently do not have access to keep this human civilizational project humming along. And having a real, authentic, open conversation about that, I think, would be useful and important. However, that's, of course, not what we're getting. Now, Mr. Trump, of course, our newly elected president here in the United States, announced 2 weeks ago that we're going to take over Greenland. You may have heard, right? And geostrategically and geopolitically, if the United States wants to retain its global hegemony, that's probably not a bad move. I'm not endorsing it. But you understand what I'm saying here. There is a geopolitical race for natural resources currently trapped under the ice caps that can be won with the application of geoengineering to gradually warm the planet. And again, very simple metaphor. And I'm going to simplify things here a little bit, but I think it's true. If we think of how convection works, Mike, convection works when we heat up a base layer and the energy bubbles to the surface, right? This is how the planet cools itself off every night in a natural scenario. The planet warms during the day, cools during the night, and emits heat to cool itself. When you impose geoengineering trails, let's say, over the earth, you shut down that convective process, right? So the heat that dissipates over the course of the night no longer is able to do that. It bumps up against that geoengineered layer, keeping the earth warmer than it should be at night. Marvin, again, Dr. Herndon, our nuclear geochemist, has done some brilliant research and writing about this. Like, the papers are all available for free at our geoengineeringage.org. And Marvin's contention is that geoengineering does the opposite of its stated goal of cooling the planet. It's actually warming the planet. And in our history essays, Ian Baldwin, our lead writer there, I mentioned him earlier, Ian makes the geopolitical and historical case for why geoengineering would be used in this way. If you look at a map of the Arctic and you understand that Russia has 200 more ice-breaking vessels than the United States. So as the Arctic gradually warms and the polar ice caps melt, Russia is going to be able to access those goodies more quickly than any other country. You see suddenly what's at stake here, yes?
Yeah, it's so powerful, so many different agendas, and we haven't even gotten to what I would say is, I don't want to say the biggest, but definitely one that should be front and center, which is transhumanism.
Oh, you're getting there. Yes.
Hey, get to that in a second. But before we do, I just wanted to get your opinion on something that my wife noticed. She actually plants according to lunar cycles. So she uses the old methods that farmers used to use. She follows the seasons, tracks the lunar cycle, and that helps her choose when to plant things. And obviously, when all of the spraying started, that became something that she was noticing every day. And she recognized a pattern that around 6 days prior to the full moon, they would stop the spraying. They would limit it around the 6-day period before the full moon. But then we would get heavy frosts on the full moon night because of that convection mechanism that you were just saying. The heat was no longer trapped, so we'd get stronger frosts. But what we noticed was these frosts would extend out further into the year. I'm wondering if anything like that has come up or anyone else has mentioned that to you.
That is a really beautiful observation right from the land, Mike, and I just made a note of that. And to make sure I get it right, so you were saying 6 days before the full moon.
Days before, even this month, we tested it again. Exactly the same thing. Yeah, 6 days before.
I'm going to bring that back to our team. I don't feel in a position to answer that specifically. However, backing up to your general question, yes. Let's talk about transhumanism in the context of what you just said, because another application of geoengineering is to enhance what I call cyborgia. A cyborg is as I'm sure everyone knows, is a mix of human and non-human materials entities. And the transhumanist impulse, I think, lies at the heart of the geoengineering conversation. And again, they don't lead with it, obviously, right? But what we're witnessing, as you know, and I'm sure your readers and listeners know, we're witnessing the ushering in of what's called the fourth industrial revolution, right? We want to electrify everything. We want to merge, as World Economic Forum nominal head Klaus Schwab is now famous for saying, we want to merge humans with machines. And if you can ionize the atmosphere and move electromagnetic energy around and surveil and track and communicate and control the battle space, right? We're not even talking about interventions like the injections we mentioned a few minutes ago, right? These experimental military grade bioweapons, as some have called them. You are much more able to influence the direction of the entire species by promoting and hastening, let's say, the merging of humans with these technologies. And this is, again, where it gets a little bit sci-fi. It's like, I'm sure many people are thinking, why would they want to do that? I think 3 reasons. It's about power and hubris, going back to the ancient Chinese emperors, because we can, right? Number 2, it's about profit. There are billions and billions of dollars in these geoengineering technologies, as there are in the pharmaceutical technologies, et cetera, right? The tech technology. And it is a form, I would say, of population control, not in a culling the population sense, I don't think, but more in a population manipulation sense. Can we, at the World Economic Forum, at the United Nations, in the medical community, in the military community, can we actually create cyborgs using these technologies? Can we melt the polar ice caps and access all of those natural resources to fuel the fourth industrial revolution, the shift to electrical everything? And so I think that's really what's at stake. And if you look at all of these applications as military applications first and foremost, again, I think it begins to make a little bit more geopolitical sense. And by the way, I think that Mr. Trump, like most world leaders, are very aware of these technologies and kind of what's going on. We do have some contacts within the Washington, D.C. community that seem to indicate they know. And even, the dead guy in the mask that they ran for president, who went under the name Joe Biden, the Biden White House issued a 41-page geoengineering solar radiation management initiative back in 3 years ago now, calling for the dimming of the sun. And again, Mike, it's odd that people still want to argue that this is somehow theoretical or a conspiracy when the White House is issuing these sorts of initiatives as executive orders. I mean, again, we're not really interested in having the "is this happening or not" conversation. It's happening. I think, again, this is an example of what we might call industry capture. Most of the entire environmentalist movement, such as it is globally, has been captured by the carbon, greenhouse gas, climate change narrative for 2 generations now. Bill McKibben wrote The End of Nature, in which he introduced to the world the phrase global warming in 1988. That was a long time ago, 2 generations ago. And so it has been, to use the phrase, psychological operation. It has been a psyop, I think, for 2 generations to make this particular claim. And this might be helpful too, can I read to you a very short but telling letter to the editor from the Guardian newspaper? Yeah, because I think it puts it all into context. And again, for the skeptics in the room, or for those who have skeptical loved ones, this might help. This is a letter written by a gentleman named Matt Anderson, who was the former executive advisor of aerospace and defense for a company here in Chicago, Illinois, the U.S., called Booz Allen Hamilton, one of the largest defense contractors in the world. So Matt Anderson writes this very short letter to The Guardian back in 2012. The title of the letter is "At War Over Geoengineering." Now, remember what I was saying a minute ago about geoengineering being first and foremost a military project. And Anderson writes this. Now, again, this was 13 years ago now. At war over geoengineering. Few in the civil sector fully understand that geoengineering is primarily a military science and has nothing to do with either cooling the planet or lowering carbon emissions. While seemingly fantastical, weather has been weaponized. At least 4 countries, the United States, Russia, China, and Israel, possess the technology and organization to regularly alter weather and geologic events for various military and black operations, which are tied to secondary objectives, including demographic, energy, and agricultural resource management. Indeed, warfare now includes the technological ability to induce, enhance, or direct cyclonic events, earthquakes, drought, and flooding, including the use of polymerized aerosol viral agents and radioactive particulates carried through global weather systems. Various themes in public debate, including global warming, have unfortunately been subsumed into much larger military and commercial objectives that have nothing to do with broad public environmental concerns. Last sentence. These include the gradual warming of polar regions to facilitate naval navigation and resource extraction. Matt Anderson, Booz Allen Hamilton.
And he would know.
I think so. And it's funny, when you search for that article now, you get that little note that says, this article is more than 12 years old. Which suggests like, well, it's probably meaningless now because, that was so long ago, 2012, Mike.
Yeah, and what you said earlier, Rob, about how they're only just now saying, well, we should start talking about it as though it's not been happening. So that's why I really appreciate the work you're doing. But I think we should pause for a quick break there, Rob. And then I'd love to just speak a little bit about things that you can practically do in your day-to-day life, because I know for a lot of people, seeing this stuff every day is very demoralizing. And the best antidote to that, in my opinion, is to actually do something about it that will increase your health and physically and psychologically. So firstly, Rob, where can people find you?
Our geoengineeringage.org is our website. You can find all the links to all of our scientific and historical papers, social media there. My own personal site is Dr. spelled out, robwilliams.com. I host a podcast called The Three Brothers Quest, in which we look at the relationship between science, spirituality, history, and look for solutions to some of these situations. And then finally, I am involved with two human health and wellness companies, NordicFlow.io and TheNordicWave.com. That's breathwork and cold plunging. NordicFlow.io and TheNordicWave.com. And I think that human health and wellness is a big part of the conversation, Mike, so we can pivot when you're ready.
What you are basically. Deep, deep down, far, far in, is simply the fabric and structure of existence itself.
Peace for all men and women, for all men and women, for all men and women. Not merely peace in our time, peace in all time.
Honestly expressing yourself.
Peace for all men and women, for all men and women, for all men and women. Not merely peace in our time, peace in all time.
The fabric and structure of existence itself.
Honestly expressing